Welcome to New Europe Studios, where you can watch us make the news. Today I'm speaking with Tanya Mazur from Amnesty International in Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine's been in the news and we've seen terrible scenes from there. So, Ms. Mazur, could you just explain to me what is the situation right now in the Ukraine about human rights?
Well, situation generally is more or less calm in Kiev now. However, it's still tense obviously in Crimea and in eastern regions and southern regions of Ukraine. And Amnesty International have been monitoring the situation in terms of human rights, and we documented numerous cases of human rights abuses starting from the beginning of the protest in November, and particularly it's a violation of the right of freedom of expression, it's freedom of assembly, it's repeated use of excessive force by law enforcement officials, it's torture, ill treatment, unfair trials, abductions, and obviously this shocking shooting at unarmed protesters. And now we keep an eye specifically on Crimea and eastern and southern regions of Ukraine and trying to monitor the situation there. And of course we have already a lot of concerns in regards to this area too.
I mean, the scenes in Kiev and the shootings played out live on TV and all over the internet have shocked a tremendous number of people all over the world, and I think it's brought once again yet another tragic reminder of the importance of human rights, the freedom of assembly and of protest. But if the situation's calm now, do you expect it to remain calm, or is this too hard to predict?
It's really difficult to predict, but in order to prevent similar situation in the future, our government should immediately start investigation of all human rights violations, of abuses which took place during last already 4 months, and this investigation should be impartial, should be independent, should be effective, and actually why this investigation is needed, because thousands were injured. Up to date, 116 people, including 17 police officers, had died, and all those victims, they demand and they deserve justice. And actually, all Ukrainian society demand justice now. Let me remind you that actually thousands came and joined the protest. They came to the square after the crackdown which took place on the 30th of November, and they came to the protest in order to protest against regime, but also, they were calling authorities to end up police impunity. And those people are still there. They still have this demand. So that's why this investigation is crucial, despite all internal and external challenges. And also, if such investigation is done, and all police officers who were violating human rights, but also officials who allowed human rights to happen or ordered human rights abuses will be brought into account, this will be a signal for other police officers and officials that human rights violations are not tolerated in Ukraine anymore.
Well, I think one of the important things of what you said, we'll get onto the justice aspect later, is that you're not here to protect the human rights of protesters, you're here to protect all human rights.
Absolutely.
So you're saying that if the new government does take itself seriously and seriously wants to be part of a more open democratic Europe, then it must investigate these incidents.
Yes, absolutely. All episodes of violence, absolutely all human rights violations. Yeah.
And have you any indications from the government that this is something they would like to do at least?
Well, I think it's too early to come up with some ideas if they're ready or not, because there are some statements which have been done by some high-level officials, also highlighting the importance of such investigation. And also we had a meeting with the General Prosecutor Office actually last week, and we've been told about the progress which was done in regards to such investigation, particularly that special group of investigators rumors was created, and they have already some suspects in regards to the crackdown of Maidan. At the same time, they were complaining that it's very difficult to identify concrete police officers who were using excessive force against protesters, because they don't have any identity signs on their uniform, and that's, of course, that's a problem. So we had the sense that there is a willingness to do this investigation, but it might be a lack of capacity and expertise, and that's actually the area where EU can support Ukrainian authorities, and to remind about importance of such investigation, to keep this pressure on Ukrainian authorities, but also probably to help with, and to send some experts on the field, but also to support Council of Europe call to create a special panel to oversee the investigation, which should be done by Ukrainian authorities, of course, and this this suggestion which came from Council of Europe was to create a special panel which would consist of one representative from Council of Europe, one representative from government, and one representative from opposition. And the task of this panel would be to monitor how investigation is done by General Prosecutor Office, by Ukrainian authorities. So it's something what should be also supported by the EU, of course. And but here, we are calling for an investigation, but at the same time, we have some concerns, because the same system failed to investigate cases of torture and ill treatment in the past. Because unfortunately, recent events just brought attention to the problem of torture and police impunity. But it's not the new problem for Ukraine. It's not the problem which appeared just in November. In the past, we documented lots of cases of police abuses, and unfortunately, such cases were not investigated properly. So,
Is there perhaps a sense that a new government and a new way of government coming into place could bring about a sustainable approach to respecting human rights in the country?
Yes, exactly. Because right now they have a unique chance to change country, to reform country, in order to ensure that human rights are respected for everybody, for all people. And so far we didn't hear, any interesting suggestions in terms of reform, particularly criminal justice reform and law enforcement reform. And we understand that situation is difficult, and especially because of situation in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. But that's also something what our government should take very seriously, and should learn lesson and do not repeat mistakes done in the past, meaning to address the problem of police impunity.
So the other big problem that I think we can see that where many people may believe that human rights abuses may be carrying on or may get worse is, of course, in Crimea. I mean, how on earth do you monitor somewhere like Crimea at the moment? That must be extremely risky for you.
Yes, it's very difficult, because we don't have any people on the ground. We don't have our representatives in Crimea, but we are trying to monitor the situation by keeping contacts with the local human rights defenders, local NGOs, and obviously with journalists. But even for them, it's not so easy to operate, because we know that some journalists were not allowed to enter Crimea, or they became victims of attacks from unknown people. So it's very difficult to get information from Crimea. However, we already have a lot of concerns, and of course that's a restriction of the freedom of expression, freedom of mass media, but also we have we documented cases of abductions. When first it was a group of 5 people, journalists and activists. They were kidnapped while they were trying to enter Crimea, and then we have a group of 3 people who also disappeared in Crimea. Those people were found, but they're reporting about ill treatment, and of course we are calling for an investigation, but we were a bit puzzled whom should we address our calls, because that's also a very complicated question, at least last week, and it was kind of vacuum because
in a power vacuum, in a very, very changeable situation where people don't really know what's going on.
Yeah,
that's going.
And usually this vacuum creates the very, the environment where human rights are possible, and human rights violations are possible, and actually they are usually happening. Yeah.
But overall, generally for Ukraine, if I understand correctly, is Ukraine has had a long record of human rights abuses. There's been another set of very questionable circumstances, at least during the latest protest. But the early indications are that the new government is not committing human rights abuses, or doesn't appear to be.
Well, it's not.
These are very early days, But they do seem to be understanding that human rights is an important signal to send to Europe and to the West and the countries that they're looking for support from. Is that?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not so confident, and I can't agree with you, because we already documented cases of human rights violations. For instance, last week we had clashes in Donetsk. It's eastern Ukraine. Those clashes were between pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian protesters, and police forces which were present during this demonstration. They didn't act properly, so they didn't because the role of police during such situation is crucial, because people. It's obvious that people can have different views, and they can express their views, even if completely different views. But if they're doing this in a peaceful way, it's absolutely acceptable. The role of police, when there are two protests and those protesters have different views, the role of police is to ensure that both sides, both groups have an opportunity to exercise the right of freedom of expression, but to do it in a peaceful way. And if there is a violence, police should react immediately, but in a proportional and adequate way. What we had in Donetsk, it's a group of pro-Ukrainian protesters were attacked by pro-Russian protesters, and unfortunately police didn't protect them, and they were just staying and watching, and they almost did nothing. So it's not something what we are expecting from them.
But I mean that also does send a signal out to people that this sort of behaviour has the unofficial approval of whoever or whatever the authorities in that area may actually be, and we're still a little bit unclear as to who is in charge, and we're still officially unclear as to who are these mystery soldiers. Yes,
but it's if we are talking about Crimea, but if we are talking about Donetsk, well, Ukrainian new government is in charge. There are no doubts about this. Of course, in Crimea it was more complicated, but eastern Ukraine, well, here we need Ukrainian. We have Ukrainian government and they have all necessary resources in order to manage situation and to ensure that human rights are protected. We have another example. Also, it's a very pity episode which took place a few days ago when the MP from Svoboda, it's a right party, he forced the director of first TV channel to resign, and he did it in a really brutal way, and this was recorded, and this video appeared in the internet, and we were expecting for the really strong reaction from the Ukrainian government, and we didn't receive it yet. Now we are waiting for investigation of this incident, but again, so far we don't have any news. And this actually, such kind of situation, it's a very good test for Ukrainian authorities. And if they
It would be very good for the authorities to really take some action and do that, just especially as the world is standing by, as it were, with their checkbooks ready.
Yes.
And perhaps people should ask one or two questions before signing.
Yeah, and that actually they also, they're committing to the European integration course, but that's. Do they really understand that European integration is not about only visa-free regime or some trade relationship, but also it's about European values, which are human rights values, first of all. That's rather now it's just a question for us, and unfortunately I'm not ready to tell you that yes, that new government is ready to act in a spirit of human rights and rule of law. But that's something what also where EU can play a really active role, and especially taking into account that the EU has a lot of influence again in Ukraine, and Ukrainian authorities are relying on the EU support, including financial support. So the EU should take this human rights-based approach in all its dealings, and constantly to remind Ukrainian authorities about the need to respect human rights and to reform the country, but also to take this human rights based approach, and all reforms should be done in line with the human rights standards.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. We do have a period now where there is a chance for reforms to be made. We're hearing from within the government that they're very serious about these, but one symbol, of course, is for the West is how do you take the same values that we have, the same rights that we have? So this is where Amnesty's symbol is, of course, is a candle. And perhaps we can hope that this is lighting a bit of freedom for ordinary people in Ukraine and for a better future for them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.